4. Ruth 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Kilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman."
Heavenly Father, we believe that when we come to your word and your word is preached, we want to listen to you, not to me. We want to hear what you are saying to us. So please open up your word to us this morning and help us to apply it to our lives for Jesus' sake. Amen. What kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person who likes to stand up for their own rights? You know what your rights are, and you like to go and ask for them. There are certain standards and guarantees within the system, and you like people to stand by what they're supposed to do for you. Yeah, you expect good consumer response if something goes wrong and you take it back to the shop or what have you. Are you a cautious person? Are you a risk-averse person? It's quite a good time to be a bit risk-averse, isn't it, really? COVID is spreading very rapidly in our community. And there are lots of situations where I think I'm particularly risk-averse. Anything to do with heights. I don't like standing near a cliff edge. I sort of do that near a cliff edge and sort of don't want to go too close to it, you know. And if you're running a kitchen for a large event, then being very, food safety sensitive is a good thing to be, isn't it? We expect certain standards, but the problem is that can create in us a sort of culture, a habit of avoiding all risk. If we are risk-averse people, we're very much at home in a sort of legalistic form of Christianity, where the focus is all on keeping the rules. And you concentrate on what you do to please God. And your Christian faith is expressed more through what you don't do. I don't do this, and I don't do that, and I don't do the other. and the boundaries you keep, and the routines and the traditions of church life and Christian discipleship. Reading the Bible and praying every day, and coming to church each week, and keeping all the rotas working to make sure everything happens. You know, we can be those kinds of sort of structured people. And here's the problem. The problem is that in all that structure and that routine and those boundaries, which are all good things, we find our spiritual comfort in our doing, in our routines, in the joy of the familiar. We put our trust in doing the normal. I mean, I say that. Can any of us remember what normal was? It feels like rather a long time ago, doesn't it? But yeah, you get my point. We put our trust in doing the normal. And what we have to realize is that right at the heart of the Christian faith is Jesus, who does the abnormal, who does not think about his own rights. He left the glory of heaven. He left all the adulation of the angels, and he became a man. And that night that he was born as a baby in Bethlehem, forgotten, in a back stable yard somewhere, we're not quite sure where, he did not think about his own comfort. He did not think about his own stability. He came and took, if you like, the risk, the danger, the vulnerability of becoming a man. Now, we're going to come back to that idea at the end, because I want you to have that, if you like, as the goal of where we're heading this morning. And everything that happens in the town gate with Boaz is, if you like, a backdrop for that. I want you to come with me from the coming of Jesus to the person who foreshadowed him, who was Boaz. The character in the story who represents Jesus is Boaz. This is a man who doesn't care about his rights. He gladly sacrifices his self-interest for the sake of Ruth and Naomi, and very much for the sake of God's greater purposes in redeeming grace. And that is all worked out at the city gate in Bethlehem, in Ruth chapter 4. And I have to say, the book of Ruth throws at us everything. First of all, it's a dust bowl. You know, it's like a Steinbeck novel, you know, where Israel is a dust bowl and people are wandering around looking for food in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, it's turned into a Thomas Hardy novel, and it's harvest time, and it's wonderful golden ripened corn. And then chapter 3, it's suddenly a bit shady and dodgy and mysterious as Ruth meets Boaz at the threshing floor at midnight. And then, just in case we hadn't had enough genres to throw at us, chapter 4 turns into a courtroom drama. And it really is a courtroom drama. Oh, and then there's a wedding afterwards, just to give us 5 different genres, all in 85 verses. So let's go to court, shall we? And meet this man of mystery who gets exposed in court. So remembering where we left the story at the end of chapter 3, Ruth has gone down to the threshing floor. She's made her big appeal to Boaz for redemption. Boaz has treated her in an honorable way and then loaded her up with grain and sent her home. And he himself has gone into town. And he goes to sit at the town gate. Now that sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? Where is the gate of Didcot? It sort of blurs into a building site, doesn't it, on all sides. The town gate in Bethlehem was, if you like, the equivalent of the county court, the magistrate's court, the place where you went to get things sorted out. Not quite the police station, more the place where the decisions were made. Civic business was transacted at the city gate. That's why you get that phrase in Proverbs 31, talking about the woman of great character, of noble character. And they say at the end, praise her in the gates. Yeah, well, what that means is all the men who gather at the city gate to conduct the city's business, they will praise her as a great woman. That's where the phrase comes from. And this is where the elders met, the elders of the town, and they sat down and they handled the business of the town. And you can go to certain places in the Middle East and Asia where this still happens today. Boaz, we're told in chapter 2, was a worthy man of standing, so he's very welcome to go and take his seat in the gate. He sits down and he waits for another man to come along, a new character in the story. Now, we've kind of already been told about him because Boaz told Ruth at the threshing floor at midnight he couldn't marry her because there was somebody else, another man, who was more closely related. He had to have the right of first refusal. What did this man look like? We don't know. Anyway, he comes up the street towards the city gate, the town gate, and Boaz is ready for him. Now, here's the curious thing. We don't know his name. Everybody in the story so far, except for the workman in the field, has had a name, but not this man. So I'm going to do the spy novel thing and call him the man with no name. All right? So we're going to refer to him as the man with no name throughout this message. But the writer has a better label for him, actually, in verse 2. This is what he should have been. Verse 1, Behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. This is what he ought to be. He doesn't have a name. He does have a role that he ought to perform. He has a duty towards Ruth and Naomi. Excuse me. According to the law of Moses, he should be their Redeemer. He should be the one who buys Ruth and Naomi out of poverty and helplessness at his own expense. Excuse me. When you hear the word redemption, we were discussing this on Tuesday evening in home group. When we use the word redemption today, we tend to use it in the sense of, the footballer who tackles someone and gets a yellow card, or who just lets in a goal and then he redeems himself by scoring at the other end. He redeems himself, yeah? And we tend to view it in that kind of, it's something that I do to redeem myself. But in the Bible, we never redeem ourselves. We cannot. It always involves our Redeemer coming to us in our helplessness and buying us out of slavery for a new destiny. This is the man who can redeem Ruth and Naomi. And Boaz sets out to remind him of this. But he starts very carefully. Boaz has got his cards all set up and ready, and he's going to play them one at a time. So he gathers 10 other men. That makes a quorum of 12 men in the gate. As far as we know, that was what they needed. And he sits them all down and he says, now listen to my proposition. Verse 3. Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. Now, there are all sorts of legal issues raised here. Did women own property in ancient Israel? We don't know. How was property passed from generation to generation? How did they record the title to land? We don't know. Why hasn't the land been mentioned before in this story? Why were they out gleaning in the field if they had land to sell? What's going on? Oh, so many questions. Who's been farming the land? Who's had the harvest of the land while Elimelech has been out of the country? And so on and so on. We don't know the answers to those questions, but Boaz obviously did. And he's very cunning here, actually. He's got a plan, and he's about to put into action. I may have said this before, but in the Old Testament in Israel, land was seen as a gift from God. He had given them the promised land, and in the days of Joshua, it had been divided up among the tribes, and each tribe had divided it into clans and families, and each family had got their own parcel of land. And they all knew where they had inherited that land from. When someone died, the land had to pass to someone else in their family. And it was shameful for the land to pass out of the family because it was a gift from God, and it was all bound up with their hope that one day their Savior would come through their children. So it would be a failure of God's plan for his people in the land if the land got sold to a foreigner or whoever. How do you think of the land that you live on? If you own your own house, you think of it as your land, don't you? Well, can I tell you, you don't own your land. The Queen owns your land. You hold it for the Queen in something we call freehold or leasehold, if you're on a leasehold title. The Queen ultimately holds the land, owns the land. It all belongs to her. So if you die and you leave no heirs, the Queen gets it. Yeah? It goes back to the Queen. And she owns a lot of land. And she doesn't just own all the land in Britain, but Canada as well, and Australia, and a great many other countries as well. Apparently, in the Commonwealth, the land still belongs to the Queen. I'm not quite sure how that works, but there we go. She owns more of the world than anybody else. There you go. Actually, I think the Queen would say, I only own it under God. Wouldn't she? She would say, look, God has given us this land, and we must use it for his glory. That the land we live on is a gift from God, and we need to steward it for his glory, and we also need to think of it as something we've received from those before us, and that we leave in good condition for future generations. Anyway, that's a tangent. Naomi's husband Elimelech, he had inherited land in Bethlehem, and he farmed it before the famine came, and then when the famine came, they all cleared off. And he and his wife and his sons went off to Moab. Now Naomi has returned, and the land can be sold to provide for Naomi, and they just can't sell it to anybody. That's the problem. They've got to sell it to someone who will keep it in the family. So the nearest kinsman needs to step in, buy the land off them. They can take the money, he gets the land, everybody's happy. It's a sort of win-win situation, really. The land becomes his land, but it stays in the family. Ruth and Naomi get the money, so they're looked after. He's redeemed them out of poverty. He's fulfilled what the law of Moses required with regard to property. And the nearer kinsman says, do you know what? That's a great idea. I will redeem it, he says in verse 4. He jumps at the opportunity to extend the boundaries of his farmland. But don't worry. Boaz isn't going to lose his opportunity. He's got another card up his sleeve. There is a problem, and cunningly Boaz knows it. Elimelech had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they've both died. Both young men married, but they and their wives didn't have any children. Maybe they weren't married for very long, we don't know. And that means that the line of Elimelech is about to die out. But as we saw in chapter 2, the law of Moses provided something called levirate marriage, the means by which you could marry, the woman, when widowed without children, could marry someone else, and the kinsman redeemer would not only buy her land to redeem her, he would marry her, and they would raise up a family. And the first child of that family, the first son, would be reckoned as the son of the man who had died. He would be keeping his line going. He would inherit the land of the dead man, and he would carry on his name. Now, this is where it gets complicated. If the nearer kinsman buys Elimelech's land, yeah, he can farm it for a bit. But if he marries Ruth and they have a son, the son inherits that land. It doesn't belong to the kinsman redeemer anymore. He has paid for it to provide an income, but it's not really his land. It's just held over until the time when the son gets it. So he pours his money and his life into this family. What was going to be a property deal becomes a marriage, and it means that the money he's spent to buy Naomi's land, well, that money's gone. And if they have a son, Ruth's son is going to inherit the land. If he does his duty and he marries Ruth, all his worldly goods he with her shares, to use the English marriage service. He gets cleaned out. That's what happens when you get married. Everything gets shared. And they might have a son, and he'll be raised in the name of his mother's first husband, Mahlon. He grows up to be a farmer. Ruth dies, he inherits the land of Mahlon. You can see the wheels going round, can't you, in the head of the man with no name. Do I really want to marry this woman? I want the land, that sounds good. But if I pay for the land and Naomi gets the money, and then Ruth has a son, well, hang on a minute, it's not my land anymore, is it? It's gone. I've spent my money and I've had a child, and the child is reckoned as somebody else's son, and I've spent everything and it's gone. And I've got nothing in return. Oh, hang on a minute. And Boaz puts this to him, verse 5. The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the dead in his inheritance. And the man with no name replies, I cannot redeem it for myself. Do you see that? He's always thinking about himself. Lest I impair my own inheritance. Presumably he's a married man with children, or he's a widower himself who's already had a family and he's got children of his own to inherit. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now, I know that's really complicated to explain, and I haven't explained it very well. Maybe I should have had a PowerPoint to help me. Can you hear the self-interest in his voice? Can you hear how he's only thinking about himself? He's concerned about his own reputation, his own name, his own inheritance. He is wanting to redeem this land for himself. He's thinking about his own rights. He's thinking about the danger that he might not have as much to pass on to his own existing children as he thought he would. And he's also thinking that he might be forgotten. He thought only about himself, and he failed. Now, why have I laid it on so thick to call him the man with no name? Well, I did that for a reason. Have you noticed how ironic it is that we don't know what his name is? He's so concerned that his inheritance will carry on. He's so concerned that his line will carry on to his children. And the writer of the book has said, you don't need to know his name. We've forgotten about him. He's unimportant. He's not going to be famous in Israel. His own legacy has been forgotten. He doesn't deserve to be remembered, even though he was so concerned about his own inheritance and his own reputation and redeeming these things for himself. There is one thing we remember about him. I could have called him the man with no name, but I could also have called him the man with no sandal. All right? That is what he did when he gave Boaz his sandal. This was an agreed custom in Israel. When you did a legal deal, presumably because land is something you walk on, if you're selling the land, one of the customs was you took your sandal off and you gave it to somebody else as a way of attesting the title. And you know that presumably you're going to take the other sandal off as well and walk home barefoot, because somebody else now is going to tread on your land and it will belong to them. So Boaz makes this lovely declaration in verse 9. You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife. Ruth the Moabite, the tragic widow with no prospects, the woman who was broken-hearted and whose entire life seemed to have been ruined, the outsider who came back and all they said was, she's that Moabite over there in the corner of the field. The foreigner who doesn't belong, she will be my wife, says Boaz. And this will be the great purpose, he continues. I have bought her to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead, that is Mahlon, in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. In other words, they'll still remember his name and his line at the city gate. You are witnesses this day. The dead man's name shall carry on through my children, says Boaz. I'm not concerned about my name. I'm concerned about his name. I'm there to serve Ruth and her family line. Now, I'm going to stop the story at that point because there are some lovely things said by the people in the gate, and we'll come to them next week. And there really is a lovely sort of marriage ceremony that takes place. It's kind of hinted at here. You can imagine the tremendous joy, and we'll save the joy for next week. Let's have double joy on Carol Service Sunday, shall we? But I just want to focus really, stop at that point and focus on this contrast between the nearer kinsman, the man with no name, and Boaz. Think about the nearer kinsman. He thinks only about his own interests. He thinks about what the law requires him to do. As far as we know, Naomi and Ruth arriving in Bethlehem has been the talk of the town. But he hasn't stirred himself to do anything, has he? He really has. He knows that he's closely related to Elimelech. He knows what the law requires. He hasn't raised a finger. He's gone about his daily life in a careless, selfish manner. He's protected his own rights. He's worried about being safe. He's worried about doing what he can for himself without putting any of his nice way of life in doubt. He's a man of substance, and he's kept his substance to himself. No risk involved, no venture, nothing gained. Do you know the parable of the Good Samaritan contains four characters, doesn't it? The man who's beaten up at the side of the road. And then there's the priest and the Levite that come along the road, and they look at the man lying at the side of the road, nearly dead. They assume he's dead. They think, if we touch his body, we'll be unclean. We're not going to take the risk. We have to touch his body to find a pulse to see if he's alive. And we're not going to do that. So we're going to just pass by on the other side. We won't take the risk. Jesus, on the other hand, is typified in the Good Samaritan himself, isn't he? Boaz is foreshadowing Jesus, and he is like the Good Samaritan here, isn't he? He is the living embodiment of grace, just as Jesus is. Boaz has welcomed Ruth to his harvest field. He could have pushed her to the edges and said, wait till we're all finished, but he didn't. He welcomed her. He encouraged her to sit down with them for a meal. He has sent her home twice, loaded with grain, loaded so high and so heavy that I wonder that she could have carried it. He has taken a deep interest in the welfare of both Ruth and Naomi. And when that night before this conversation, he could have behaved in a very selfish manner, as a man who was rather merry with wine down at the threshing floor, and a woman approaches him in the dark. No, he behaved honorably when he could have been supremely selfish. He has allowed another man to have his say first. His generosity has been bountiful and overflowing, and he hasn't worried about his own rights. Boaz is like the Good Samaritan, isn't it, who is himself a picture of Jesus. The Good Samaritan came where the man was in the parable, didn't he? He came where the man was, beaten up at the side of the road, and he went to him and he touched him and he loved him and he cared for him. And Boaz has done that for Naomi and Ruth, isn't he? And Jesus has done that for us. He has come where we are. He came where we are and he became flesh. He suffered every temptation that we've ever suffered, yet he never sinned. Jesus told his disciples that he did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Christmas is about the eternal Son of God laying aside the glory of heaven and letting us have just a slight taste of what that glory was like when the angels appear and the glory of the Lord shines around and the shepherds are so afraid. We had a hint there in the angels appearing to the shepherds of what Jesus had left behind. What a contrast to what they found when they got to the manger and wherever the smelly circumstances were in which it was situated, and they found a little baby, rather unusually, laid in a manger. Paul says to the Corinthians, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, that you by his poverty might become rich. He made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men. If the Son of God is prepared to lay aside his rights for the sake of others, what might you or I do to serve others as Boaz did? You see, we can be legalistic Christians like the nearer kinsman. We can think about our rights. We can play it safe. We can just think about ourselves. Or do we let the grace of God flow out to others? If we say that we're disciples of Jesus, let's be honest. Which are we more inclined to be? Are we like the nearer kinsman, sticking by the letter of the law, willing to do our duty just as far as it takes us, and if it serves our own ends, and no more than that? Or are we people of grace like Boaz, where it overflows? We measure with the measure of grace. We long for this lost world to be redeemed. We're willing to be spent. We're willing to spend and be spent if it means that others will hear the gospel. Churches that reach out to their communities, churches that make themselves known in their communities, depend upon people who learn to give themselves, not just their money, or in terms of effort on a rota to make the Sunday service work, but giving our time to people, hospitality, sharing our lives with people who are not yet Christians, understanding how other people think, getting into their world. You know, think of a missionary going to another country and learning the language, learning to be an idiot in somebody else's language until they've actually become fluent, allowing them to be filled with such a love for the lost that they leave behind their culture, they leave behind their identity, and they adopt a new identity in that country. And in a way, we've got to do something of a measure of that here as we get into the lives of other people. Those of us who've lived in Britain all our lives should not think that we're exempt from that challenge. We're called to be disciples of Jesus. We're called to follow in his footsteps. We've got to learn to serve rather than be served, so that the grace of Christ can flow out from our lives into the lives of others. Well, let's hail redemption's happy dawn, shall we?